Okay, we're going to get started this evening. Welcome. It's great to see all of you here. We're pleased to welcome you, our audience, and also those joining us remotely on the live stream to the first Constitution Literacy series of our academic year. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to come and learn more about the Constitution and increase your understanding of this amazing document. We just want to remind those that are in the live audience that we are live streaming, and so it's really easy to pick up any sort of chit-chatter or loud noises, so just make sure that we're keeping our any sort of chit-chat nice and the volume low on that. We'll begin our event with an invocation offered by McKay Norton, after which Caleb Randall will offer or lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for this amazing school and all that it provides for us, and we're thankful for the gospel in our lives, and we're thankful that we can all be a part of this school. And please help us to have fun today and be appropriate and listen and be a good audience, and please help them to have a good debate, and please help us to help find people to have the Spirit of God in their life, and in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
In honor of one nation under God, please stand. Please recite the Pledge of Allegiance with me. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our debaters this evening. David Hancock is a member of the AHS High School faculty. Prior to joining American Heritage School in 2010, David was a practicing attorney. He is a cum laude graduate of BYU Law School and has argued dozens of constitutional issues in court. Jeff Hymas joined the American Heritage faculty in 2016 after working with many organizations, presenting hundreds of lectures on the Constitution to live audiences across America. He holds an MBA from Idaho State University and is a magna cum laude graduate of BYU Marriott School of Management. My name is Adam Brewer, and I joined the American Heritage faculty last year, and I will be serving as the moderator this evening. Tonight, we are excited to be discussing the topic of gun control. We'll first hear a brief lecture from Jeff, Mr. Hymas, who will teach us about the basics of the Second Amendment and some of the key issues surrounding its interpretation. Then we'll have a moderated debate between David and Jeff. After the debate, audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions in a Q&A. We'll take a short break, however, between the debate and the Q&A session. We encourage you to think of tough questions to ask our debaters for this portion of the evening. Let's go ahead and begin by giving Mr. Jeff Hymas a round of applause.
Glad to have you guys here. Should be a fun night. We figured we'd start I was just going to say start out with a bang, and I thought that'd be a horrible pun, but there it is. Start out the year with a bang. We're talking about gun control. Quite an interesting topic, a sad topic in a lot of ways. It's current news and the things that are happening, but definitely a debated topic because it's such an issue that's so close to life and death, right? Such an important issue to discuss. We're doing things a little bit different in this debate. We may do things different on the other debates, but in this one, as we sat together a couple days ago and thought, okay, how can we contrast our views and help the audience really enjoy our different points of view? We got talking and thinking, well, actually we have the same point of view in terms of what the Constitution says, what the Second Amendment says. So let's just present that. And I decided, okay, I'll present that. And I'll just share with you what our common views on what the Second Amendment says and what it means. And then from there, we have divergent opinions on how to apply it, or what's the best way to handle the issues behind it. But with that said, this is just a brief overview of the Second Amendment. First of all, here's the words. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And what David and I feel, and we throw Adam in this group as well, is that what it says, where do I pitch that? Okay. The Second Amendment says what it means, and it means what it says. Pretty straightforward, okay? It's very clear about what the intent is and what the wording is, what the language means, and it says it pretty straightforward manner. I want to break down just some of the 3 parts that I think are the most interesting, most foundational to the clause there, the Second Amendment. The right of the people. We believe it's an individual right. The phrase right of the people shows up in the First Amendment. It shows up in the Fourth Amendment. It is an individual right. It's not a right that's granted collectively or to the government. It's an individual right. As it states, it's the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. Not a lot of debate amongst us in terms of what that means. Second corollary to this right of the people is that it was a fundamental right that really wasn't hardly debated at all in the Constitutional Convention. It was just given. Like, everyone knew that. No one was saying, well, I don't know about this, I don't know about that. It was just very, very straightforward. Everyone in the convention agreed this is a fundamental right. It's an individual right. Let's move on to more important things, more controversial things, because we all agree on this. Let's just move on to the next thing, which is kind of interesting, because when you look at the debates surrounding the Constitution, most of the issues are very debated. This one is pretty straightforward, pretty much full unanimous agreement on it. Okay, the next phrase that's important. Oh, sorry, the last point here. This is an important point, actually. The armed citizenry was absolutely critical to the success of the American Revolution. The idea that the right of the people themselves were armed, was crucial, was critical to the American Revolution having success and coming off as it did. Without the people being armed, even as it was, our chances were super, super low of winning. But the fact that the people themselves were armed gave us a chance, and with God's help, we were able to win that revolution. But without the people themselves being armed, it was just never even a chance. Okay, the next phrase, to keep and bear arms. Okay, a couple of corollaries that are involved in this. First of all, it was clear that the original intent of the Second Amendment was to provide security against and parity with a potentially tyrannical government. Okay? The idea of the Second Amendment was, after all, for the people to be able to defend themselves against a tyrannical government. That was the biggest issue. And to give them parity, in other words, equality. Whatever level of power that the government had to inflict tyranny, the people themselves reserved the power to defend themselves with that same level of power against that potential tyranny. Okay? So the original intent was definitely to provide security against a potentially tyrannical government, both in terms of the purpose and then the power they granted to the people, or reserved to the people. Okay? Also, arms. When you talk about arms, the definition of that, really any existing weapon, not just guns. We tend to think of arms as guns, as rifles or pistols, but in the context of the Second Amendment, in the context of the original wording of it, arms meant any existing weapon, not just guns. And to prove that, the most powerful weapon at that time was a warship, right? And warships were even implicitly referred to in the explicit constitutional language found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, where it talks about Congress having the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal. If you don't know what that means, it may not make much sense. A letter of marque and reprisal is simply a government writing a letter, giving authorization to a privateer, a person who owns a warship, and saying, hey, you go carry out this warlike act on our enemy. And so if you think about that idea, the concept is there, that of course there were people who owned the most powerful weapon, the most powerful arm at the time, which was a warship. And so it's implicitly implied, but explicitly stated, that they have the opportunity to, through a letter of marque and reprisal, to use their own level of power, the most powerful arm there was at that time, a warship, in that effort. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully that does. The last phrase that's important is shall not be infringed. Okay, we talk about the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and the last one is shall not be infringed. If you look at some of the recent, or not way recent, at least in the last 20 years or so, the Supreme Court decisions, both Heller, McDonald, and Bruin being very recent, all of those have consistently upheld the right to bear arms against governmental infringement. And so as much as there's controversy about gun control and how much there should be, and if it should exist in the first place, and how far the government should reach, the Supreme Court has been very, very clear in both. The Heller case is basically a District of Columbia case, so a federal case. The McDonald case is a city case, Chicago, and then Bruin is a state case, New York. And at all three levels, the Supreme Court has said over and over, we read the Second Amendment as not allowing the government to infringe on the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. Okay? So shall not be infringed is not only a common understanding that we have, but also the Supreme Court has ruled consistently on that. But here's kind of the controversial part. Here's where the fun begins, right? Even though it is fundamental, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to bear arms is not an absolute right, and reasonable restrictions are universally accepted. You may say, no, I don't think they are universally accepted. That's controversial in and of itself. And I'll just ask you, the crowd, if someone who's mentally and emotionally unstable, should they have a gun? Okay? Someone who's a felon, a convicted felon who's proven they don't have the capacity to manage those things. So at some level, everyone has this idea that, yeah, it's universally accepted. There has to be some type of reasonable restriction. Now, where that line is and how much, of course, that's very debatable. But the idea that it's an absolute right, you shall never have that infringed, I don't think we're going to go that far to say shall not be infringed ever, absolutely never. That goes too far, and that's something that most people, all people, I think, would say, no, there has to be some reasonable level of restriction on those. So, the three key phrases are the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Those are some of the commonalities we have, and now we're going to spend some time kind of debating where we diverge from that, our different interpretations, and where the line exists in that.
So just a quick change of plans. Thank you, Mr. Hymas. We are going to take just a quick break right now, so those of you who haven't had a chance to go grab refreshments, you're welcome to do that while we do just a quick 5-minute setup for our debate format. So come back in 5 minutes, and we'll begin our debate. There we go. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for joining us this evening. Now that we've had a chance to hear a really great introductory lecture from Mr. Hymas, we're going to jump into the debate portion of our evening. What I'd like to do is actually start off our discussion by talking with Mr. Hancock, who we haven't had a chance to hear from yet, to see what are his thoughts on the Second Amendment and what position does he take in terms of how we should look at the Second Amendment today in modern times.
You know, that's a really broad, wide open question, so I guess I get about the next 30 minutes to talk about this. My view on the Second Amendment, I share Jeff's fundamental view that the Second Amendment says what it means and means what it says. We, the people, have the right to bear arms, and the way that I view the Second Amendment is it means exactly what it says. The people have an individual right to bear arms. And in my view, that means all weapons of war, regardless of how they are developed or when they were developed. So I have a very expansive view of the Second Amendment as far as what it should allow, that it does involve a broad range of arms and weapons that are protected under that Second Amendment because of my view that it was intended for the people to have parity, in other words, the same ability as the federal government with regard to weapons of war. I think the place where I greatly diverge from Jeff is I think that the need for the Second Amendment as well as for the desirability of the Second Amendment has changed dramatically over the past 200 years. And so my view of the Second Amendment is that the Second Amendment, although it does provide that right, I feel that it should be repealed and replaced. And that in repealing and replacing it, it should be put in place something different, something that is more in line with a modern society, something that recognizes that the arms that we have developed over the last 200 years are too powerful and too destructive to be held in the hands of private citizens. And as a result of that, I think that it's something that should essentially be eliminated and put in place with something new.
So just to repeat for the audience, Mr. Hancock, you're suggesting that the Second Amendment should be repealed and replaced. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
My view is that it should be repealed and replaced. However, until it is repealed and replaced, it should be enforced as written.
Okay, interesting. So I would suspect that for members of the audience, that is perhaps considered a relatively radical position that you're taking. Curious to hear how Mr. Hymas would respond.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty radical. Yeah, so I think there's some logic behind the idea. Wait, the arms aren't, we don't want my next door neighbor to have a nuclear weapon, right? Like, hold on. If we're going to actually read the Second Amendment as it says, and it means what it says, and it says what it means, then how can you logically hold that to be true? Because the logical consistency is, if you're going to allow them to have the right to do that, they should be able to have a nuclear weapon. And I think everyone in the room would say, well, that doesn't make sense. Of course, you need to have some type of reasonable restriction. I think, so the response, I guess, it'd be a question, I guess. And I could go off into philosophizing about my ideas about what a militia is, etc. Maybe we talk about that later. But I think the question is then, what would you repeal it with, right? Because you can say, okay, we need to repeal that. And how far would you go with that, I think is my question. How far would you, if you're going to repeal means to kind of wipe off and then replace it with what? And maybe the two-pronged question I have first is, why? Not only because maybe arms is too broad, is there anything else, other reason? And secondly, with what? I think that's where I would go. Unless is that all right? I avoided your question by just asking more questions. But to me, we all kind of thought that would be the
Can of worms, right?
Yeah, it is.
Vote Jeff Hymas. He's running for politics now. You can tell because he won't
Avoiding questions, yeah.
He won't answer the question. My view is that the prevalence of guns in the United States is far more deadly and dangerous than many of the other difficulties that we are faced. And keep in mind, too, those of you that have seen this series of lectures last year will remember that my fundamental view of the Constitution is a social contract position, where I view that the Constitution represents a contract that our community, our society has created in order to govern our daily interactions. So for me, I believe that it should be repealed, and replaced with whatever it is that the people believe it should be replaced with. That may be replaced with nothing, in which case it would be left up to the legislatures of the states and of the federal government to determine what regulations should be applied to guns. Or if we want to have some degree of protection for the right to bear arms or the ability to have guns for self-defense, then there should be an amendment that is put in place that specifies what that right is. But what I see is just too much danger, too much death, too much violence, and too much destruction caused by guns in the United States. And as a result of that, for me, the right to bear arms has outgrown its usefulness, and that as a result of that, it in the interests of the peace and security of the people, which is another thing that I believe is part of that social contract, that interest is preeminent and should be the one that controls how we look at our ability to commit violence against each other.
So that gives me more meat to sink my teeth into, hopefully. So it does come down to me, in my mind, the social contract versus the natural law. Social contract says whatever we as a society agree to do, the best for us. That's what we're going to do. And I would say that is not. The foundation and the origin of our right to defend ourselves comes from God. By nature, we have the right to defend ourselves, and you can't repeal the Second Amendment. Like you can't repeal a God-given right. I have the power to defend myself, whether or not. Of course you can, right? You can write it out and go through the whole process, etc. But that right to defend yourself is not a social contract right. It's not granted by government, because if we're granted by government could take it away, and therefore we have to say okay. But it's a natural law. It's from God, and so we can't repeal it and deny that we have the opportunity to defend ourselves. And then I think my second point, I think when you said it's outgrown its usefulness, that there's too much gun violence, I would agree there's way too much gun violence. But I'd say guns aren't the problem. The problem are the people, right? The guns don't commit crimes. The people behind them are the ones that commit crimes. And so to say, Jefferson said essentially that if you levy a law on people that they have to get rid of their guns or confiscate their guns, the only person that you're going to have any effect upon is those law-abiding citizens. That's the problem. Is law-abiding citizens need to keep their guns to guard against the law-breaking citizens who won't follow the law in the first place. And so to say we're going to repeal the Second Amendment, we're going to solve this problem, I think I don't call it naive, but I think it's unfounded in terms of it's not going to get rid of the problem. It's going to make the people who are law-abiding citizens be at the mercy of those who are non-law-abiding citizens, and you end up exacerbating the problem, because now you have not only that, that's the private sector, right? Look at the public sector. Not only that, we have the government now who's armed, and the people are armed. So not only have the government, who throughout history is shown to tend towards tyranny, and you have the people who are the only people who are armed are the bad people. I think you have kind of a double whammy there, and you're gonna run into some big problems without leading a very strong and focused and protected right to bear arms and protect yourself.
David, would you mind clarifying your position in terms of you suggested that the Second Amendment has outgrown itself and has led to an increase in various societal costs, right? So if you could clarify your position and then respond to Jeff's point.
Sure. So back in 1791, when the Second Amendment was approved by Congress, you had a situation where the vast majority of arms in the United States consisted of a musket. You had a few cannon that was owned by government. You had warships that were owned by individuals. I'm not aware of any individual owning a cannon on land, but there's no question that individuals were able to own cannon. But you look at the rest of arms, you had some swords and you had some things like that. The ability of the government to wage war on people was relatively limited, because the people quite easily could obtain and use the same level and degree of arms that the government used. Today, that's a very different circumstance. So I looked it up this afternoon. An aircraft carrier costs in the neighborhood of $15 billion, and that's just for the ship. That doesn't include any of the arms. That's just the ship itself. You start adding the planes. The planes are around $2 million a piece. Bombs, they're pretty expensive. And you start going through the process, and it turns into a situation where the average American no longer has the ability to either purchase, obtain, or use the weapons that are available today. So if you think about the ability of the common or average everyday person or the community as a whole to check the power of the government if it was to become tyrannical, you quickly see that but for a rebellion in the ranks of the military, the citizenry really has little to no power to actually do that. If we go one step further, what we see is the potential destructive power of these weapons and arms is completely overwhelming. And so when you look at, again, a cannon in 1791, what can a cannon do? Might be able to punch a hole in a building. Depending on the type of shell it's included in it, it might be able to cause some damage to somewhere between 10 and 15 individuals. But you don't have the ability to wipe out square miles of land and all the people that live within it. And so you really have is a complete exponential growth in the destructive power of weapons. At the same time, you have little to no ability in the citizenry in order to keep up with that. I also believe that the structural checks and balances that were put in place in the government are adequate in order to protect the people from tyranny. The states, our ability to vote, a lot of those things are in place and allow us to effectively check the power of the federal government to exercise tyranny over its people. So consequently, I just see that the ability or the desirability of having citizens having that level of armament is just simply not there. On the flip side of that, you see the destruction and the violence that we commit upon each other. And so you get about 45,000 to 50,000 deaths every year from guns in the United States. Approximately half of those are murders, half of those are suicides, and you look at just the sheer quantity of death and violence that we commit upon each other as a result of having firearms in our regular possession. And it's something to me that you look at the price over time, we're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of lives in just a couple of decades, whereas if we are looking at the ability of the people to check the tyranny of the government, we really don't have a need to do that. Because I think that within the political and structural mechanisms that the Constitution sets up, we have effective checks against the powers of the federal government already.
Jeff, care to respond?
Well, I think the traditional response, we've all, if you're a gun supporter, the traditional response is, well, if they didn't have a gun, they would use something else to hurt someone or to commit suicide or whatever it is. There's no question that guns are more effective at doing that and therefore more dangerous in terms of that. One thing I wanted to point out, I think what Mr. Hancock or what David presents, I think is fair. There's a logical inconsistency in my argument. It's that, the original reason to have the Second Amendment is so that the people have parity, have equal opportunity to have the same amount of weapons or the same type of weapons as the government. Therefore, with that balance, they can protect themselves with that equality. That balance doesn't exist anymore. I don't think anyone argues that. I've got my little BB gun. I'm going to shoot an F-16. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to defend myself.
I'm not sure why Jeff's using a BB gun. He could get something significantly larger.
A little bit better. Maybe a 22 or, whatever. 30-06. Okay, but the idea, so there is some logical inconsistency because we're saying, well, wait, if that's what you're basing your idea on, that we should be able to defend ourselves, just be honest with yourself for 1 second. You can't defend yourself against the government. So we need to go back to the Social Contract Board and decide how to handle that. I would argue that although it's true there's a logical inconsistency there, what I argue is the answer is not in saying, let's just kind of re-look at this thing and let's go back to the Social Contract Board and everyone decide how to best regulate those arms. First, because I don't think it'll work, like we talked about earlier. I think it's just illogical to think it'll work. Secondly, because, shoot, I lost my train of thought. completely.
I'll pick it up.
Thank you. Go for it.
David's completely right. Everything.
That was it. That's what I was gonna say. So yeah, first one says it's not gonna work. The second one is it doesn't. The basis should still be on this idea of to be able to defend yourself. That's what the decisions should be based on. That although it's not like perfectly practical, the parity, the foundation, the basis upon which you make those laws shouldn't just be like, well, let's just accept the fact that government's bigger than us and they can kill more than we can, so let's just work with that. I think we should say, no, let's work with the idea that the intent is that the people can guard against a tyrannical government. You have to start there. That should start your foundation. One thing that's interesting, I don't know when to throw this in, but I'll throw it in now, is I think, David, is the well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state? That's the first clause of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. David has said that that's inconsequential, just some introductory language, right?
Yeah, I actually didn't say that, but that's actually absolutely how I feel.
Okay.
It really has little to no impact.
And I would say it's actually pretty crucial because it's a introductory statement to who the people are. It says a well-regulated militia. And when you look back at the documentation, what a militia was in those days, depending on the state, but in general, it's males 16 to 55 years of age. They all need to have their own guns. They need to show up once a month. They need to get trained. They have to be organized. What it does is it puts the power to defend yourself in the people, not the power to defend yourself in the hands of the government. And that's central and crucial to the idea behind the Second Amendment. If it's a God-given right for me to defend myself, I don't give that right to the government to do for me and say, man, I hope they do that well. Right around 1900, I think it was like 1901, there was a major switch, a major flop from the militia, which is based in the people owning their arms, governing themselves, being able to defend themselves with weaponry, with arms, to what was called the National Guard. And everyone thought, that's not a big deal. I think it's a huge deal. I don't think a militia is the National Guard. The militia is the people. If you look up the writings, James Madison said that, George Mason said that in the Constitutional Convention. The militia is the people, whereas the National Guard, all of a sudden things start to change. It's more of a top-down. It's more of a federally organized, federally mandated and controlled instead of from the people organically choosing. So if you were to take just kind of a symbolic look at this, it's not practical nowadays. We walk so much away from it. But what if the F-16s and the tanks and the anti-aircraft, all that stuff, what if that was owned by the citizens of the state through their militia in a locker, and when things go wrong, they go and unlock the locker and they use that, it's theirs, and they're there, they have the same powers, the same ability to use those arms, it's just that they get to use them in their defense. What if we need to fight a war? Well, that's fine. Then, like it says in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, then the Congress calls those militias up to battle. They take their arms with them and they go to battle, right? But that way, because right now when you think about it, those arms, the F-16s, the aircraft carriers, all those things, those are, none of us really consider that we own that, right? It's more like, well, the military owns and runs that. And we kind of think of this defensive and this armament as something out there that the government does for us. And I think that's the fundamental bad position, is the government doesn't do that for us. It shouldn't do that for us. We should do it for ourselves, and we're part of that organized force. We're part of the militia who organizes themselves, and we're the ones who are defending ourselves. It's kind of hard to even imagine that and now in the current state of affairs how it is. But I think if we'd gone along that way the whole time, we'd be in a lot better state to say, oh, I can defend myself. I do have the necessary arms to do such a thing. Because the militia, me, I'm part of that. I own that. I'm responsible for it. I take ownership of my own defense. I'm in that instead of just handing it over to the government. So I'm not sure if that's a little bit of tangent, but that maybe provides more for you to go after.
I was just going to say that if those kind of weapons are in a locker that is controlled by the state, that they're not borne by the people.
And that's what so thanks for clarifying. I wouldn't say it's the state is still the government. I would say it's still local. It's still the local militias working together, and they're still the ones who are in charge. So it really is in the hands of the people. So I would clarify and modify my statement, not to say that the state would have the key, the people themselves would have the key, as organized, as militia, as commanders of militia, as voted by their own local units, and they're all organized from the bottom up, and they're the ones who make those decisions, because then they're the ones who are actually exercising the right to defend themselves.
And so the idea of my neighbors having the key to the armory, to me, doesn't make me sleep any better.
To me it does, because I voted for them, and I'm part of that. Like, he's my neighbor. Like, we're on the same team. I'm way more nervous about the government having the key to the locker than my neighbor having the key to the locker. I think that's maybe the fundamental difference.
Just to compare and contrast your views, it seems like there is some agreement in terms of the idea that there is a lack of parity between the citizenry and government in terms of firepower, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, just going back to a point that you made, David, and I'm asking this as a moderator who has heard views that might see your perspective as weak in terms of the notion that the citizenry has, because of the notion that they have no chance of fighting back against a tyrannical government, that we should do away with the Second Amendment. Because I think there are plenty of examples, at least in U.S. history, where guerrilla warfare has been quite effective against a large-scale power, like in the American Revolution versus the British Empire, or if you look at the Viet Cong versus the United States, to the point where the United States withdrew early from Vietnam because of how effective that guerrilla warfare was. So my first question is how would you address that opposing argument to your position that the citizenry has no chance? Secondly, you mentioned that you have confidence in the checks of the United States. But I think, when you look at historical precedent, and this was kind of a point that Jeff was making, that, democracies routinely go through, if you look at Latin American countries and even over in Europe, democracies routinely go from democracy to a tyrannical dictatorship and perhaps back to democracy. And that in those cases, if the citizenry had been armed, and in many cases like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, the citizens were disarmed post-democracy, they essentially perhaps would have had a chance to prevent those tyrannical takeovers of their government. So how would you respond to that second criticism of your argument there?
Okay, so first criticism about the ability of a citizenry to wage guerrilla warfare and how successful that's been. First, what I'd say is that when you look back at situations like in the Revolutionary War, what you had was actually fairly close, if not identical, parity in the ability to bear arms of the citizenry, the people here in the colonies, versus the British Army. They were actually hampered by distance from their power base, and we basically had the same degree of weaponry that they had. Sometimes it was a little more difficult for us to obtain, like we had to go out to Fort Ticonderoga and capture the cannon and bring them back here. But there really was a wide degree of ability in the citizenry to bear the same kinds of weapons. So the parity was actually very, very close. When we get further on in history, say with the Vietnam War, what we see is that there was insufficient willpower on the part of the United States to wage war in Vietnam. The United States had a great deal of superior firepower, but there are arguments to be made that it wasn't the Viet Cong that were keeping the United States in check, but rather it was China and Russia who were keeping the United States in check, who had the greater power and the greater ability, and we just simply didn't have a strategic interest in Vietnam. And so it was a lack of will on the part of the United States that prevented the United States from escalating that conflict or having a more effective conflict. People might point today to Ukraine and say, well, look, they're waging a successful guerrilla campaign, except that they are receiving arms from the West, and in doing so, they're actually using very sophisticated and very expensive weaponry that they couldn't otherwise afford. They're being trained by members of the United States and other Western European militaries, and so they really have a great deal of ability to utilize weapons that are beyond their regular capabilities if they were citizens. So I would say that the guerrilla warfare argument, I think it's interesting, but I don't think that it holds. And there is an exception. The exception is if there is rebellion among the ranks of the military. If the United States was to develop a tyrannical government and elements of the U.S. military were to rebel against their commanders and switch sides, as happened during the U.S. Civil War, that you would have a completely different situation. And I think that I trust my fellow citizens more in that respect, for the military to refuse to obey illegal and immoral orders than I do for my neighbor. And by the way, I have great neighbors, so everybody just keep that in mind. But for my neighbor to refrain his or herself from using violence or force when that isn't warranted, I trust the trained professionals in that respect to say, no, we're going to do what's right, and we don't care who ordered us to do otherwise. On the second question, what was the second question?
Just in terms of democracies routinely going from democracy to dictatorship, and even though, God forbid, that hasn't happened in the United States, shouldn't that be a concern of U.S. citizens that they should be able to fight back against tyranny?
And I think that United States citizens should always be concerned about tyranny, but I think that the answer to tyranny is not necessarily violence. Violence is a state of last resort, and if we ever get to the circumstance where there is nothing left but violence in order to save us, I don't know that there is any saving us. You look at John Adams saying that a republic is fit for a moral people, and we have to be moral in order to use a republic. We do. And if we lose that morality, our democracy, our republic will fall. And we have no one to blame but ourselves. I see within our political and constitutional structure a plethora of ways to correct tyrannical behavior long before it gets to the point where the citizenry has no choice but to raise up arms and to fight against its government and to overthrow its government. And when you look at other examples of democracies that have fallen throughout the world, most of those countries had a very short history with democracy when democracy falls. The United States is a unique situation in that its tradition of democracy, its tradition of a republic which is in the hands of the citizenry, is long, is deep, and abiding. And I think that gives the United States a unique situation, probably only second to England in its ability to resist tyranny through internal structures. England has actually done, I think, a very good job of resisting tyranny despite the kinds of guarantees on the bearing of arms that we have in the United States. They have still continued to resist the kind of tyranny that you might see within their country and by a monarch on the people of England. And as a result of that, I think that, yes, I think is it a risk? It is a risk. But to me, the greater risk is putting too much power in the hands of individuals who are immoral and incapable of exercising that power. I would rather have the trust be in the society as a whole rather than in the hands of an individual who wants to take power into their own hands for whatever reason.
Can I respond to that real quick? I think I can respect your opinion on that. I think the couple things that I think of first of all is the Constitution is written by the founders. If they had come to the conclusion that, you know what, we have such good checks and balances, we have such a good system, which I believe it is an incredible system. I believe it is way better than arms. I think it's way better than fighting and shooting over some issues. But they came to the conclusion, as do I, that not only do we have the checks and balances, the federalism, the guarantees, the states, all these things that are going on, but they also said we need the Second Amendment. They didn't say it's enough, we don't need the Second Amendment. They said it's awesome, it's wonderful, it's great, it's divine, but we also need the Second Amendment as that last shield, that last protector. Patrick Henry and George Washington both said during the convention time, I'm not sure it was right, during the convention, but both of them said just the idea that the threat that people can have arms, that in and of itself is like a saber rattling, right, in its cover to say, just so you know, we are all armed, so you probably don't want to start that because there's going to be a million people who aren't going to like that. If they didn't have that, if they said, look, it's great enough, we've got all the checks and balances, and they knew, well, no one's armed out there and only we are, there's a little more incentive to kind of open the imagination about what we can do to fix some things. Whereas the rattling of the saber of the people saying, I've got a gun, by the way. Oh, yeah, okay, wait, maybe we should rethink this. I think that actually helps them push the response and push the reasonable action back into the realm of government instead of in terms of, the ballot, in terms of fixing things legislatively and congressionally, rather than just taking these big steps knowing that, well, who's going to resist them anyway? Let's just go for it. I think those two things are important. First of all, the founders realized it, and they conscientiously put the Second Amendment in, even though they'd written the Constitution. And secondly, that constant threat of the people to have those arms is important. I think Jefferson said, when the people fear the government, there's tyranny. When the government fears the people, there's freedom. And I think that's kind of the basic idea. Were you going to say you're wrong? I'm sorry. What? Go
I
ahead.
was just going to remind you that the original Constitution actually didn't have a right to bear arms in it.
Correct. But that's what I'm saying. Is they saw that.
It also didn't have speech, though, either.
It didn't have speech either. You're right, but
or freedom of religion.
and I would also say that it was the states that really wanted the amendments. It was the states that wanted to limit federal power, not state power. They were trying to put themselves in a situation where the states had the ability to defy the government, not where the people had the ability to defy the states.
And I would disagree, because I feel like the Second Amendment doesn't say the right of the states to keep and bear arms. It's the right of the people. It goes all the way down to the people, and that's what they're saying, is we need something this fundamental, this foundational for the people themselves to be able to bear arms and defend themselves. But we could argue about that more, probably.
So just to clarify, Jeff, so David's essentially taking the position that the cost of the Second Amendment, of people being able to bear arms with high suicidality in the United States, a high number of homicides that take place every year, especially in urban centers, those costs outweigh the justification to bear arms for the sake of overthrowing a tyrannical government. So my question for you is, how do you address, from your perspective and view of the Second Amendment, how do you address some of those societal costs that are resultant from people's right to bear arms? And from that constitutional perspective you're trying to take, kind of an originalist or textualist perspective, how do you address some of those qualms that people have regarding those issues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? Because there's no question on one hand that happens. The availability of guns causes, higher suicide, homicide things to happen, right?
Well, real quick, so from what I understand, and I know there's a lot of statistics surrounding, surrounding guns, and you always have like statistics thrown back and forth. But I think one that's clear is in the last few decades, since the 90s, homicide rates have actually been sliced in half, and yet the amount of firearms has actually skyrocketed in the United States with that disaggregation of homicides in the United States. And so I think the connection between a higher prevalence of guns and increased homicides is actually a tenuous connection at best. So,
I was going to say suicide rates have gone up, though.
yeah.
So
Well, perhaps suicide rates, but homicide rates, yeah.
Yeah, so the point I was going to make is that it's a good question, basically. How do you handle this? Like, the basic point I think I would say is that there's no silver bullet. I think what I said earlier is that guns don't commit crimes. I think the big challenges that we have that has gone way up, obviously, is the mental illness. The challenges involved with that really skyrocket all those statistics, or at least make them be more volatile. And so I think if we're focused on guns as the problem, I think we're going to continue to miss the target, right? Miss what's really going on. What's really going on is the people behind the guns, people holding the guns. They're the ones that we need to focus on. And so to continue to say we're going to take those guns away doesn't solve the problem in my view, because it's not dealing with the real issue. And what it's doing, if you're taking guns away, we always have to remember there's no such thing as taking guns away. You can't take guns away from the bad guys. You can take guns away from the good guys who will follow the laws, but you can't take guns away from the bad guys who won't follow the laws. I think that's not going to happen. I think it's been shown in just logic itself to say only the problem is the people who don't follow the laws. They're the ones who are using guns for the bad things. That's the black market. It proliferates, and we cause more problems than we solve by doing that. So not only in the private market do we disarm the good and allow the bad to be armed. In the public, we allow the public not to be armed and the government to be armed, and both those things are headed in the wrong direction. So I don't know if I think I've kind of repeated an answer from earlier, so I'm not sure if I caught the nuance on your question.
Yeah, I think so. And that reminds me of our discussion previously. David, you suggested that, so you said your neighbors are nice, right?
Yes, they're wonderful neighbors.
Yeah, this is on YouTube, so,
They're the best.
So you suggested, however, in our conversation previously that you would rather your neighbor not own a handgun. Can you explain your position on that?
Yeah. The possibility of someone with a handgun committing violence against somebody else I think is just unreasonable. Now, I have neighbors and have had neighbors that are wonderful. And I've had gun-owning neighbors, which are also wonderful. I had a gunsmith that was my next-door neighbor. Love the guy. He's great. But at the end of the day, the amount of harm or damage that you can do to each other without a gun is much lower. And the ability to have to have somebody lose their temper or whatever is just makes it too dangerous in my perspective. I know that in some parts of the United States, you hear gunfire every single night over and over and over again. In my part of the world, I don't hear that. But in other parts of the world, it is something that is just a cost that is too high. And I do disagree with Jeff that you can't take them away from the bad guys. I think you can take away from the bad guys. But you have to have the political will to do that. You have to establish the appropriate laws. They have to be constitutional, which is why I think that the amendment should be repealed. And then you have to have the willpower to follow those laws. When we look at the vast majority of gun crimes in the United States, and by this I'm meaning violent acts and homicides, someone broke the law long before the violence occurred. And if we were to effectively and diligently pursue those initial crimes instead of waiting for the violent crime to take place, I think that we would have a much safer and a much more secure society. In the case of suicides, the existence of the guns are what is driving, in part, that suicide rate. So you take a look at suicides in the United States. Men are 80% more likely, 8 times more likely to die from gunfire due to suicide than are women. And also, having a gun in your possession dramatically increases the likelihood of a male committing a suicide, which is why suicide rates among men are so much higher than they are among women, is because the amount of damage that can be done with a firearm is just so great that the ideation and the act can be nearly simultaneous. And so the ability to protect us from ourselves, I think, is something that's important. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that the government can determine that someone is mentally ill or is suffering from some kind of a difficulty and therefore go in and take their gun away. So I think the solution is let's just restrict the guns in the first place, and then we don't have to worry about trying to go in and take them away afterwards.
So would you suggest that the citizenry shouldn't own handguns, but generally the police should?
I agree that handguns are probably one of the biggest problems. To me, it's the handgun which is the biggest difficulty.
So in just like 20 seconds, how would you respond to the argument that when you disarm the citizenry but arm the police, sometimes it takes the police a long time to arrive? So if you have a home intruder, because I think that's why a lot of people in the audience likely own a firearm, right? It's because maybe they don't use it for sport, some probably do, but many own it for self-defense in their home, right? So if the citizenry was disarmed, essentially your only saving grace would be waiting for the police to come in the case of home intrusion. And you're okay with that fact that would be resultant from your position there.
And this is one of the things that I think that I reject, is the idea that if we were to outlaw guns, that criminals would continue to have guns and that good people would not. Guns are a finite commodity. They have a life, and after a certain amount of time, then they cease to function. And although, yes, black markets will exist, but black markets exist in many ways. And you look at other countries that have some significant gun control regulation or some gun control laws, they have far lower violent rates than we do. They have far lower homicide rates than we do. In some cases, as much as 1/5 or 1/6 of where the United States' homicide rates are. You just look at our partner to the north, Canada. Theirs are significantly lower than ours. They have very similar cultures, similar values, and similar kinds of rural communities that we do, where guns would be used for hunting and for other kinds of sports that a lot of people feel is reasonable. But they do have restrictions on how guns can be used and how guns can be purchased. And as a result of that, they have a far lower crime rate and a crime problem than the United States has.
Anything to respond, Jeff?
No, I was just going to make light of your question and say, don't worry. If a home intruder comes in, you just say, hey, don't you know it's against the rules? He's like, oh, yeah, sorry about that. I still hold very firmly. I think that probably our biggest difference is I really don't think you can take guns from the bad guys. I think the bad guys are going to get those guns. And it was either Patrick Henry or George Mason who said, essentially, it'd be great if everyone agreed not to have guns, but there's some who would say, no, I will have a gun, therefore everyone should have a gun. And I think that's the only logical conclusion you have to go to with that.
Yeah, and I just to add to your point, Jeff, I mean, I think again, and from what I've heard from the arguments outside of this discussion, is that the statistics are very nuanced, right? And so even though some other democratized Western powers have lower homicide rates, when you take out like some of our major cities and assume those as outliers, then all of a sudden those homicide rates start to equalize, right? In the UK, for example, even though they have lower gun deaths, in the UK they actually have a higher rate of violent crime than we do in the United States, right? And so I think I wonder if some of those statistics that cite those lower homicide rates don't take into account particular cultural factors or other issues at stake that don't account for some of that nuance.
And I'm sure that they don't. And you can always look at different countries and make comparisons. For example, you look at a country like Israel, where they have some of the highest gun ownership rates in the world, and they have very, very good homicide rates. But you do have a degree of violent crime. You look at a country like Switzerland, which has some of the lowest rates of violent crime, but they have, again, some of the highest gun ownership rates in the world because they have mandatory military service there. So you get outliers on both sides, but if you look at the statistics from a broad general view, you look at countries who are economically at parity with us and their rules. The United States has by far the most liberal gun laws as any nation, any developed nation.
Meaning non-restrictive, right?
Not non-restrictive. Yeah. And we also have the highest murder rates and gun violence rates of any of those developed countries. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that taking guns away solves the problems. And, to your point, Adam, is that we have significant violence issues in our major cities. And I think that is as much a problem of not enforcing existing laws as it is to...
So it's a policing issue.
It's a policing issue. It's a policing issue. And you have this the political will to do those things which need to be done, and to uphold the law and to keep the streets safe. But at the same time, I think it's also naive to think that guns are not a part of the problem. And, with 400 million guns in the United States, that's more than one gun for every man, woman, and child in the United States. You can't help but think that in some way that large number of guns is some part of the problem and is contributing to the difficulties that we're experiencing.
Before we move to our Q&A, Jeff, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to respond to Jeff or to David's points?
No, I think I'm excited for the Q&A. I think I'm interested to see what the questions you guys have. So.
Okay, excellent. Let's go ahead and give these debaters a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, we're going to open up our session for question and answer. We have about 27 minutes before our time is over for this evening. So we welcome questions from audience members. We have a mic here. When you approach the mic, just make sure to speak clearly in the mic so those on the live stream can hear your question. We'll get through as many of these as we can, and without further ado, our first question is from Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Jacobson. So my question is, are there any laws that we could make to help lower gun violence other than restricting gun ownage?
I think that there are. I think that we actually have a lot of laws on the books that could restrict gun violence. I think the difficulty in a large number of circumstances is our failure to enforce our existing laws. And in fact, I would say, like I think I mentioned this before, that whenever a murder, whenever gun violence occurs, in the vast majority of times, a crime has previously been committed. Someone has obtained a gun illegally, somebody has used or modified a gun illegally, transferred a gun illegally, and that there are a number of things that have already gone wrong and have either been refused to be prosecuted, or there's no time, energy, and effort being made to prosecute those crimes. And so to me, I think that if we would just enforce the laws that we have, that it would go a long ways to solving the gun problem. Now, on the flip side of that, though, I have serious questions as to how many of those laws are constitutional, given my view of the Second Amendment, which is, I know it seems to be illogical and inconsistent, but I told Jeff
Maybe it
earlier.
is.
But I told Jeff earlier this week that logic and consistency are the hobnobs of small minds.
And I'd answer, Peter, I think that's a good question, because, yeah, instead of talking about restricting gun ownership, let's talk about other things. Just one thing from my experience, I spent 4 or 5 years lobbying state legislatures and city councils and county commissions, like in the political process of designing bills and things. I never got involved with gun control bills. But one thing I have learned, that as you get into, there's tons of nuance. There's really, really interesting things as you try to figure that out. I think you're asking the right question. And as you get in there and get serious about talking to lobbyist groups on both sides, you'll see some answers. One that I've always been intrigued with, maybe I'd be accused of being hypocritical here, but I think, unless someone learn otherwise, I love the idea of biometric mandates. Biometric meaning your gun is attached to you in terms of your fingerprint, whatever. It doesn't work unless you have the biometric matchup. And biometrically, we can. There's more. It seems like that's one good idea that might help us to get it out of the hands of the people who shouldn't have it. And if they're, obviously there becomes a lot of privacy issues at that point. There's some biometric database. Like, what do we do there? There's a lot of issues in that way. But I think biometric might be an idea that we could look into, where the gun won't fire unless the right fingerprint is in the right place that's associated with that gun, and no one can get that gun because there's a little more restriction on who gets those. That might be more helpful. So that criminals who steal those guns or black market, etc., that they're not able to, we'll see. Who knows? I don't know all the details on that. That seems like a logical place to start in one area.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Great question. Benson, you're up.
Yeah, I'm Benson Lee. Is the Gun-Free School Zone Act constitutional?
The gun what?
Gun-Free School Zone Act.
No. That was decided in Lopez v. City of Chicago. Lopez versus
U.S. versus Lopez. Isn't it U.S. v. Lopez?
U.S. v. Lopez. Thank you. United States versus Lopez. In there, the Congress had enacted a statute prohibiting guns within, I think it was 500 feet or 1,000 feet of a school.
using the Commerce Clause.
Using the Commerce Clause. And the difficulty is the federal government doesn't have that power. They just don't have the ability. Can a state do it? Now, that's a different kind of a question. Under my interpretation of the Second Amendment, no. People have the right to bear arms, and that they should be entitled to that right. And just because that right is sometimes inconvenient, I don't think it should be disregarded.
But that's why you'd say it should be repealed, because you want to work
Yes.
through it, right?
Yes.
And I would say that's exactly why it shouldn't be repealed. I think my maybe simplistic mind is, man, if we have a gunman go into a classroom and the teacher has a gun, well, then we have a little bit more parity, right? A little bit more opportunity to defend ourselves and not just sit there and hope that the police get there and all these bad things we read about in the newspapers are happening. I think that in essence, that's the issue. Am I armed to defend myself, or am I waiting for government to be armed and the bad guys to have arms and not me? So I would say the Gun-Free Zone Act isn't constitutional, and it's wrong-minded. It's going the wrong way. I think the right way is to accept the bad people out there, and guns can be used to do bad things. Therefore, we should put guns in the hands of good people to do good things with them.
Just real quickly, because I think there's an interesting disagreement that both of you make, or that both of you have. So, Jeff, are you okay with state and local governments creating gun-free zones? Because that actually happens quite a bit across the country. Cities will actually have gun-free zones in their whether that's on public property or even in public parks, you may be walking through a public park and have no idea that you're not allowed to carry a firearm in that park, based upon the city creating a gun-free zone. So clearly, the national government, via the Supreme Court, is not allowed to do it. How do you feel about local governments doing that quite a bit across the country?
I think it's wrong-headed to have public or government gun-free zones for the reason I explained there. I think private entities have the right because it's their private entity. It's their place. They get to choose what happens there. If they say we choose to have a gun-free zone, then you get to choose. Okay, am I going to be a part of, belong to, enter into that private domain or not? And therefore, you're either accepting that or not accepting that by choosing to associate with them, your freedom of association. But I'd say in terms of public, no, I'd say I don't think that should happen. I do think it's naive to think that just because you make a rule, only the law abiders are going to follow the rule and the lawbreakers are going to disobey the rule. So you end up creating a very disparate situation where you're in trouble because the bad guys are armed.
Whereas, yeah, in most cases of mass shootings, it's usually in a gun-free zone.
Yeah, right.
And
to add on that, if you look at those, at least I'm not very well versed in this, but the few I've looked at to support my point of view is they look at that, right? The situation in Aurora, Colorado, that the gunman passed three cinemas to get to a gun-free cinema because he knew he'd have no competition. He didn't want to go to one that allowed guns, and he might have competition. He passed three of them to go to the one that was gun-free. So,
thank you, Benson, for your question. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Nora, go ahead.
So my name is Nora Redding, and my question regards Mr. Hymas's point that the guns aren't the ones committing the crimes, it's the people behind them. I was wondering if you had any ideas, practical strategies, or ideas of how to put this into action, like more investigation into people buying guns or rigorous standards for the purchases of them or anything like that.
In terms of how to make sure the people behind the gun, the bad people behind the gun doing the bad things, we kind of work on them instead of the gun. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd add anything more, but I do like the biometric idea. I do like the idea that your fingerprint is you, and there's something along the lines if we can restrict that fingerprint from being able to work on guns, or only certain guns work. The gun only works as biometrically tied to a responsible citizen. That's kind of a thought. I don't have any other. I'm sure there are way more informed people about different ideas that could happen there, but. It seems to me like mental health, there's some records there. We can find out who has some mental health issues. I think criminal activity, all those things are important. But, just because someone's a criminal or has been a criminal is released from prison, of course they get a second chance, etc. But I think there's some certain consequences to that as well. But how do you say you're a convicted criminal, you can't have a gun? Just to say you can't doesn't solve anything. That's why I think we need to take it to more like a biometric situation. I don't know. I'd welcome other ideas because I don't have a ton of depth of different ideas on how to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nora.
Good question though.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, that's the fundamental thought behind what I'm thinking.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Joseph Holmes, and Mr. Hancock, you mentioned that there are 400 million guns in the United States, and how would you propose we go about confiscating all 400 million of them?
I'm not proposing that we confiscate all 400 million of them. What I'm proposing is that if the United States was to decide that the Second Amendment had outlived its usefulness, it would repeal the Second Amendment and replace it with something else. I don't know what that other thing is, and I don't know what what our community as a whole would decide that should be. But let's assume that they were to say, no, we don't want any handguns. Then what we would do is we would need to have some mechanism for trying to gather up as many of those guns as possible. Are we going to get them all? Absolutely not. That's naive to think about that. But there are mechanisms in the United States Constitution in order to grab property that is illegal. So, for example, in the United States, it's illegal to have various kinds of drugs, and you read every day about how the police have seized various illegal drugs that are being trafficked one way or the other. And I think what we have right now in the United States is this lack of desire and this lack of commitment to addressing gun crimes. You read about this in New York frequently. They stopped the stop, question, and frisk policy in the 1990s, whereas before the New York City Police Department had the ability to stop, question, and frisk people that the police believed may have a weapon or
What does that mean? What does stop, question, and frisk mean?
So stop, question, and frisk means that if a police officer sees somebody and they have reason to believe that that person is a threat or may or is about to commit a crime, they can stop them, they can question them, and they can do a pat down, which is called a Terry frisk. And what they do is they're looking for a gun. And during that time period that the stop, question, and frisk policy was in place in New York City, crime in New York City went from one of the most dangerous cities in the world down to a very nice place. Unfortunately, New York is going back to one of those more dangerous cities, and part of that is because they have stopped the stop, question, and frisk policy. And so I would say that there are things like that could be done. The anti-gang violence units could go out and could do those kinds of things. There are ways to target illegal gun sales and to verify and check up on people who are convicted felons. They're all on parole. They're prohibited from having a gun. And under the conditions of their parole, the government is allowed to search their premises and search those individuals. That is something where they have lost a civil right because of their disobedience, because of their violation of the laws. And it's through the Due Process Clause of the United States Constitution. So for me, those are some of the ways that we should do it, not trying to go into people's homes and confiscate guns. Although I think that they could have the power to do that if we were to repeal the Second Amendment. I don't think that's practical. I don't think that's realistic. And I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
They stopped doing that in about the mid-'90s, and I don't remember. It was after Giuliani left office, and who was the one after Giuliani? Anybody remember? Bloomberg. So Bloomberg continued the stop, question, and frisk policy for part of his office, but there began to be increasing criticism of the policy on the grounds that the stop, question, and frisk policy was being used to racially profile various individuals. And so it was phased out for that reason. And you have similar things going on in New York now where the bail policies of New York are being phased out because of concerns about racism. And as a result of that, you see the crime rates in cities like New York going up and the illegal gun possession and illegal gun use going up significantly. And that's a whole nother debate. You're right.
Yeah, just real quick, for the students in the audience or whoever may not know, racial profiling, like they stopped doing that because the accusation was that cops or policemen were choosing certain races, in this case, black, brown races, and saying we're going to do the stop, question, and frisk with them, but not others. And it became kind of a tool for them to separate and try to focus on races. And so that was the accusation. That's why they stopped that, because it seemed like they're just focusing on certain races, trying to get them in trouble instead of all criminals in trouble. So that's why it stopped.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So in Alma 43:47 it says, "And again the Lord said that ye shall defend your families even unto bloodshed. Therefore this cause were the Nephites contending with the Lamanites to defend themselves and their families and their land, their country, and their rights and their religion." How would you suggest we do that if the Second Amendment was repealed?
That's why we have a military, in my mind. So it's the military that does that. You look at the context of that particular scripture there in the book of Alma, and Captain Moroni is doing that. He's calling upon the people to rise up and to be part of the military. He wasn't calling on them to be armed mobs. He was calling them to be in their militia groups, if we're going to call it that, or to be under the command of various generals and commanders who were the authorized representatives of their government. So I don't see that as citizens doing that. And the flip side of that is I think that the context of that is important. The level of parity that those people were able to have against the enemies, again, is quite simple. A sword, a knife, a club, a shield, a spear. Those are very different kinds of levels and expense items in comparison to the kinds of weaponry that is available today.
And I'd argue that, to me, that's a perfect example of the people themselves, the citizens themselves, saying, yes, we do need to rise up, and we do need to, and that's why I'd argue that is essentially the militia. It's people who are already armed using their arms to go and organize themselves and fight against a bad force, and their tyrannical government in this case, if you take it that way. But to me, that's a perfect example. I think that scripture to me says, it screams individuals armed, getting called together as a militia, going forward in an organized way to defend themselves, to exercise their God-given right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Next question.
I'm Celesta Remington, and my question kind of derives from Mr. Hancock, your comment about the statistics of gun deaths or deaths due to gun violence, murder versus suicides, and then also the discussion that's happened on the stage all night about how do we possibly determine if someone is fit to own a gun or not, and utilizing the laws that we have. So I was wondering if any of you have heard about how Washington State legislature has this voluntary waiver of firearms option, and how, it wouldn't necessarily help if someone already had firearms in their home, but if they didn't own a firearm, a lot of times people with suicidal ideation are fighting it for a long time. And they recognize that this could be a problem for them. And if they're fighting for their life, they're trying to be healthy, they're trying to stay here, they can go in and file this voluntary waiver of firearm rights that prohibits them. It puts them then on the criminal background check lists that makes it so they cannot buy one. And they can choose to do that of their own choice in advance to hopefully protect them from in the moment really, really impulsive decision that then they can't go back on. And a lot of families, survivors of those who have died by suicide are pushing for this. My question for you is, Washington State is doing it. I don't know what other states, if any others, have that option. And there are a lot of public service announcements and the health departments and things putting things out saying, if you have family members who are struggling, encourage them to lock up their guns somewhere else or something like that. But this would allow people who don't have guns to be able to just go in and say, I can't buy one, I can't get one. But I'm wondering what you think about that as a possible solution to this, and maybe what some of the problems might arise with that. I wondered about the possibility of that being weaponized by saying, oh, someone cannot get a job here unless they fill out this voluntary waiver of firearms.
I love your question. Thank you. There are actually more than Washington State has that law. I think that I was listening to a report about that this summer. One of Utah's congressmen is trying to get that federalized, basically saying that states have to have some kind of a registry that people can put themselves on, and that those registries can be accessed by all gun sellers in order when they're doing that background check. So I think that there is some potential value to that. I share your concerns that those kinds of things have shown in the past to sometimes be weaponized in various ways. I disagree with Jeff on his desire for biometrics for similar reasons. I think that if we are giving that kind of personal information into a database that could then be used against us, that is something that's it's potentially a serious privacy right violation or a privacy violation. And I can see that there could be people who do that. Now, I'm less concerned about an employer doing that, because I think that that's a place where the open market takes care of that. That if I'm willing to take that kind of a job, then there are certain burdens that I would have to have. But if that burden is too much for me, then I shouldn't take that job. So I'm less concerned about a company potentially using that than I am about that kind of information being misused by the government. I have a great deal of skepticism about governments using this idea of mental health in order to restrict certain rights. Because we have found in the past that sometimes governments make decisions about what is mentally healthy and what isn't mentally healthy in ways that are not appropriate. So you look at the 1920s, 1930s, and the forced sterilization of individuals and things of that nature because of supposed mental health issues. and the institutionalization of people. And so I think that under those circumstances, I do share your concern about having people do that. But on the other hand, voluntarily saying, I shouldn't have a gun, I think that is okay. My concern is how do we use that? What do we do with that?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Appreciate it. Next question.
Hi, I'm Dixie Banks, and I was wondering, do you guys think that the government should raise the gun age of purchasing guns, should stay at 18 with private sellers, or should it stay, and should private sellers do background checks?
What's the current age? It's set 18, is that what you're saying? Federally?
Mm-hmm.
And your question is, should it be raised?
Mm-hmm. Should it be raised or stay?
I'd have to hear the debates on both sides. My initial knee-jerk reaction is stay the same. 18 is the level of adulthood, and I think that makes sense. And then your second part of your question was?
Should private sellers do background checks, like FFLs?
I think so. Yeah, there's no question. In every issue, it's really, really simple. It's like, yeah, of course they should, or of course they shouldn't. But as you get deeper and dig deeper, you realize then there's privacy issues, and there's all these different things that come up and down the discussion. But I think in general, I think it makes sense to say, I think that's a reasonable restriction to understand at the selling point, at least, that you wouldn't sell it to whatever organization or person deems, worthy person to have a gun. I think the background check is a reasonable thing to do. The details of that, I think, are debatable, but yeah.
Yeah, and if I may, I think where often this debate lies is, are 18-year-olds capable of owning a firearm, of purchasing and owning a firearm? And there's the debate surrounds, what rights are 18-year-olds given? Well, they're not allowed to purchase alcohol, but they are allowed to vote, right? And so some rights are granted at 18, and others are not, right? Now, we, of course, are talking about a fundamental constitutional right that's guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. So I think that's where you see a lot of the disagreement is, even though an 18-year-old isn't necessarily fully cognitively developed, they are considered an adult, right? And they are allowed to vote. So should their right to purchase and own a firearm also be allowed or curtailed? And it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and that's similar to what I was going to say. Because it's a fundamental right in the Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, it's guaranteed to all citizens. And I don't think you can restrict an 18-year-old from purchasing a gun. In fact, there was a state recently who had their law overturned by a federal court on that very basis, that they tried to raise the gun ownership age to 22, and the court said, nope, 18 is a citizen. They must be granted the same rights of citizenship as every other citizen.
Which state, do you know?
It was in the South. I cannot remember. Do you?
I was going to possibly say Louisiana, but I can't.
That sounds right. It was in the South. I would hate to say which one.
Thanks, Dixie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Hannah Hatch, and my question is, because we're talking a lot about restrictions and stuff, but also saying that guns aren't what's hurting people, it's people that's hurting people. Do you think that there should be mental health care for people who have thoughts of harming themselves or others? Do you think it should be more heavily encouraged for them to find help or more easily accessible for mental health care? Would that be any sort of solution, do you think?
I do.
I do too, yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's one of the great difficulties of our society is our unwillingness to help those around us who are suffering. And whether the mechanisms of how we offer that help, I think, is complicated and difficult. But there is no question that we should be reaching out and helping people who are suffering from mental illness, and helping them to get what they need and to get them through that mental illness to a place where they are able to do the things that they need to do.
Earlier you were saying about just like the line where the government might cross when they're talking about mental disorders. Do you think that would be the government's place to help those people, or would that be private organizations?
I think the government plays a role in that. Jeff's going to disagree with me on this, but I think the government plays a role in that. But I also think that this is a place that private organizations have a great deal and ability to play a very significant role. Charitable organizations should be reaching out diligently to people who need that kind of help. But I also think the federal government should, and the state governments and local governments should be doing what they can do too, within, here I'm going to say, reasonable limits. So you take a look at some of the things that the state of California has done. I was reading a report recently where they are spending $300,000 per year per homeless person in the state of California. And yet the homeless problem in California is getting worse and worse and worse. And a large majority of those people are suffering from some form of mental illness. And to me, it's unconscionable that we are that ineffective in delivering help that it's costing that much, if that makes sense. I think that there are ways that we could deliver that help more effectively if it was done through private organizations or charitable organizations, rather than necessarily some of the inefficiencies that we see with government.
Yeah, I'd agree. I would say the last part there, private is the best way to go. Government has shown over and over again that they're not the best at doing things outside of protecting our rights. They're pretty poor at doing stuff that that people themselves can and should do on their own, of their own desire and will, instead of having the government do it through forced taxation and administrative programs that exist regardless of their effectiveness. So, should we limit the
thank you, Hannah, for your question.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah.
For those that are questionnaires that we still have remaining, I'm gonna limit both of you to 20 seconds per answer, and I'm gonna cut off the line so that Ms. Vanderbeek will be our last questioner of the evening.
I think that's unfair. Jeff can clearly talk way faster than I can.
I can fit a lot more in.
Speed it up, David. Next question.
My name's Bree. Mr. Hancock, if we can't seize drugs very successfully, why do you think what? Yes, confiscating drugs guns is gonna work?
I think there's two basic reasons. Number one, I don't think we try to stop our drugs at their point of entry into our country. Number two, drugs are so much easier to conceal than a gun. And so I think those two things by themselves make it much easier. Somebody's walking the street with a gun, an experienced police officer is going to be able to spot that 9 times out of 10. And that's where I think that stop, question, and frisk policies come into play.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Jace. I don't care who answers this. Recently, many liberal-run cities have defunded the police. Crimes in these cities are at an all-time high. Local citizens are not getting a response from 911. Isn't this where having armed citizens would be a deterrent to criminals?
Yes, and I yield my 19 seconds.
Thank you. To me, the answer is no, because it's the kind of the idea of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes the whole world blind. You know, if we have this arms race between the private citizens and the criminal element, we're just going to end up with the wild, wild west, where we have shootouts at the OK Corral happening every afternoon at high noon. So I think the better solution is to have the public willpower to enforce the law the way that it's supposed to be enforced, not abrogate the responsibility with an idea that if we don't enforce the law, people will learn to behave.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
So this is a data point, and in saying this, I am not minimizing the two main topics, the mental health side that we've been hearing a lot about tonight. I lost a nephew to suicide recently. The suicide rate in the UK with basically no guns is about 11 per 100,000. Switzerland's about the same. Hong Kong's at 13, no guns. Switzerland, lots of guns. US is about 13.5. So the point of guns and no guns does not associate directly, or at least causally, to a materially different suicide rate. We have no guns in some places, guns everywhere in other places, suicide rate's effectively the same. So part of the, I don't want to say mischaracterization, but at least the aura of mischaracterization of availability of guns creates a straw man that I'm not comfortable letting stand. So there's my little comment.
Thank you. Any responses from our debaters?
What I'm just going to say on that is, in my perspective, the availability of guns doesn't create or enhance ideation, but what it does do is create a circumstance where ideation can be carried out. And I do think that there are places where gun ownership and gun use are better trained than in the United States. And that's where I think is, so you look at Switzerland, for example, every adult there has been trained how to use a gun and how to use that gun safely. Now, are there problems with the statistics? Absolutely. And I'm not saying that there is a direct correlation, but to me, I think that when you look at the totality of the cost, it's just a high cost.
And the only thing I'd say is that statistics, you can get statistics to say whatever you want them to say, and statistics are always like, I don't know, I don't get that excited about statistics because they always throw me off, but I like the logic behind things, and so yeah, I think I can, like when we were quoting earlier about Canada, and I was like, yeah, what about Switzerland and Israel, right? Like it seems like no matter what, you can find an example to counter that. So yeah, that's all I'm at. Not discounting what you're saying, just simply saying that I think statistics get thrown out a lot, and it's like, well, okay, but they seem to say what the statistician or the person wants to interpret them to say. So,
thank you for your question. Final question of the evening.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much. This has been fascinating and enlightening. Both of you have had great points of, on each of these things that were really great to consider. So there's been a lot of talk tonight about the Second Amendment addressing what to do against a tyrannical government and like a home intruder. But this is a real-life example that happened recently that kind of addresses a different category. So in 2020, we saw close to 600 violent riots, and some where the police completely abandoned, and they just left people alone to defend their private property and themselves. And the government response, rather than to strengthen the police to do its job, it has, like the young man said, it's defunded the police and gutted it. And in one of the presidential debates, one of the candidates, the vice president candidate, rather than discouraging that, they actually encouraged more demonstrations. And so the government seemingly was kind of supportive of those kinds of things. So my question is, if the Second Amendment is repealed, what do people do when the government fails to protect them from complete anarchy?
Great question. Thank you. Any responses from our debaters?
I would say, those are difficult circumstances, but if the Second Amendment were to be repealed, then it would be up to our lawmakers or to the people as a whole to decide what the rule would be on a going forward basis. And so, like I said at the beginning, I'm very much a proponent of the social contract theory of government. And so, whatever that is, and I don't pretend to have a crystal ball that I could see what that is, but that's how it would go forward. There may be limited gun control that is allowed. We may be able to use the kinds of firearms that we do today, and that we're just taking away the larger scope that I'm saying the Second Amendment currently covers. But if we were to remove weapons from the people, I think that there would be less possibility that the police would need to abandon a riot or a neighborhood because of a riot, because they would have the wherewithal. I also think that it's, and I mentioned this before, I think it's just atrocious that in certain of our communities that we have abrogated our responsibility to keep each other safe by properly funding the police, by properly doing those things that need to be done, and by enforcing the laws that we've agreed upon. So I think it really just depends on what replaces the Second Amendment. But I think it's a wonderful question.
Yeah, I'll just add a different angle because I'm tempted to say the same things I already said. The different angle is if it were repealed, I would really, really like the states to decide, and I'd like counties to decide, cities to decide. I would like the law of reality to jump in and say, let's try it. Let's see if Utah knows what they're doing or Utah County knows what they're doing. Let's put it up against New York City. Let's see which one has the best ideas. And I'm pretty sure those who understand the proper role of government and the true principles, the divine right of each individual to protect themselves will have a better place, and people flock to them, and people leave the other places. Just like they're doing today with, when you're looking at economic policies, California. They leave California, it doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work. They start coming to places like here, and they say, anyway, we go off of it. Don't bring your socialism here. The reason you're coming here is because we don't have that, right? So give a chance to let freedom prevail and let those individual laboratories do that. I hope it isn't repealed, but if it were, I would say, great, let's go for it. Let's let each state, each county decide how they're going to do it, and the proof will be in the pudding at that point.
We're so grateful to audience members for your awesome questions, to both students and parents. Thank you. Let's give our debaters and you another round of applause. We're grateful for those who joined us this evening, our live audience, and those who watched remotely or will be watching later. Thank you for your participation. We also like to thank our AHS school administrators, Jay Clark and his team on the technology, and others who assisted in making tonight possible. Our next event will be Friday, October 21st, so mark your calendars at 7 p.m. Please invite your friends and neighbors so they too can benefit from this very educational experience that we all had this evening together. To watch previous sessions and other resources, make sure to visit constitutionandcivility.org. We hope to see you next time. Thank you again, and good night.